I look back at President Ford's 1976, which of course was the year of the Bicentennial celebration for the United States of America. So America's 200th birthday. This year, of course, is America's 250th birthday. So it'd be interesting to think about how America was celebrating 50 years ago. But also, of course, it was a year of big events, big people, big players. President Ford himself, Governor Ronald Reagan, future President Jimmy Carter, the fallout from Watergate, fallout from Vietnam, etc. So over to Richard to tell us about it. Thank you, Richard.
Hello, everybody. It's great to be here. I will say good morning, though I know it's good afternoon there. I'm just getting a little buzz. My internet connection is unstable, so if I cut in and out, James, give me a thumbs up if I'm starting to have problems, or at least indicate somehow. James asked me to talk about 1976, which is one of our favorite years here at the Ford Museum. That's because not only was it the bicentennial and the election that Ford was running, it's just a fun year. A lot of things happened. It's pivotal in the life of Gerald Ford. Now, this year, as James mentioned, is the 250th anniversary / birthday of America. 1976 was the bicentennial. That's easy, 2 centuries, great. The 250th is the semi-quincentennial, which I will tell you right now, Microsoft Word does not recognize and puts a little red squiggly under it every time, but it's in my emails all the time. But we're going to talk about 1976. And we're going to start off with a little review. I did not keep great attendance on who was with us last time, so I hope we have some overlap. If you were here last time, go ahead and put that in the chat so that I know. But Gerald Ford got off to a rocky start. In 1976, he became president in 74, unelected, following a resigned president when Richard Nixon resigns from the Watergate scandal. And Gerald Ford had taken over as vice president when Spiro Agnew resigned from his own scandal. No one had elected Gerald Ford for anything in the Oval Office. He was basically coming in without a mandate. He didn't have any platform. He had not promised the American people anything, so that wasn't hanging over his head. But at the same time, he had to find out for himself, would the people choose me if I ran in 1976? Now, when he comes into office, he's inherited the Cold War, the Vietnam War, a financial crisis, and a constitutional crisis because we've never had a president resign before. His time in office was marked by difficult decisions, in most of which he clearly chose what he believed to be for the good of America over the good of his own political career. For example, he thought it would be best to pardon Nixon, get that off of his plate so that he could focus on other things. That was extremely controversial, haunted him the rest of his life. It became basically one of the things most people know about him. He also offended the right by offering clemency to draft dodgers from the Vietnam War. By 1974, we had somewhere between 30 to 50,000 young American men who were avoiding military service, either living underground in the United States under assumed names or having fled to other countries. Gerald Ford wanted to bring these young men home for the good of the men and the good of America. He said, let's not ruin their lives forever over this. But he didn't want to just blatantly say, okay, everything's forgiven. He cut the middle path and said, what we're going to do is we're going to offer clemency, a sort of public service works to get them back without having to go to jail and having it on their record. This did not work for anybody, as it turned out. It was a middle road option which displeased everyone. Also, the end of the Vietnam War happened during his presidency in 1975. This was a staggering blow to the United States because, of course, we were on the losing side. And we had paired up with South Vietnam, North Vietnam won. It was a huge blow to Ford's political career. He also was working on the Cold War, and he went to Helsinki, Finland, and signed the Helsinki Accords, which historians will tell you, many of them, was a good thing in the long run, but at the time it was seen as capitulating to the Soviet Union, and the press basically lambasted Ford left, right, and sideways for that. Also, he had the economic crisis. He used his veto power like 60 times to try and cut government spending. He enforced budgets. He was the president who made America eat its vegetables. That's how I like to phrase it. And that did not make him popular in any way, shape, or form. At one point, when the city of New York went bankrupt, they asked the federal government for a bailout, basically a cash infusion. And Ford said, "Show me a budget document." And they said, "No, just give us the cash." He said, "No, I need to see how you're going to spend it." And they said, "No, don't worry about that. Just give us the cash." Well, he said no. And let's just say that did not go over well in New York City. And New York City is one of the largest voting blocks in the country. So that wasn't helping Gerald Ford. So going into 1976, he decides to run for president for his first time on his own merits and attempt to be elected on his own, despite all of his very specific unfavorables. When they did the first poll, Gerald Ford versus the Democratic candidate Jimmy Carter, it came out 61% for Carter, 32% for Ford. And this was a common sentiment of the day. Since Ford was so quick to use his veto power, they figured, let's call him on it. Now, the good news for Jerry was that it was 1976, our bicentennial, and America had gone red, white, and blue crazy. Having lived through this period, I can tell you there was red, white, and blue bunting on gas stations. Grocery stores were having promotions. You could buy the little colonial tri-corner hats everywhere. It was just a very patriotic year, expressed in its own very weird, kitschy, consumerish way. You could get buttons to wear, very cute. You could get your George Washington cake pans to make a George Washington cake. No comment on that one. But people also got very crafty. There were things like lunch boxes, sure, but also jewelry people made to celebrate the bicentennial. That's the sort of official bicentennial logo, the star with the red, white, and blue banner around it. We have a huge number of craft items because 1976 was also a very crafty year for America. People would make quilts, knit blankets. We had sweaters. We had people doing all sorts of knitting things and sending them to the president as gifts, all of which wind up in the collection of the National Archives. The Presidential Gift Office is part of the National Archives because all of those things will eventually come to the president's museum. So we have a large collection, thousands of handmade gifts from Americans feeling patriotic in 76, which is impressive considering it was also the recovery from Watergate, a bad economy, Vietnam. It really helped bring up the morale of the people for the year. Do me a favor, for those students in attendance, put a 1 in the chat if you know what a transistor radio is. I'm doing a quick poll. Just pop a 1 in the chat if you have any idea what a transistor radio is. I got 1. That's about what I thought on my poll. All right, if transistor radio was a portable radio, oh, hey, somebody who owned one. All righty, me too. Mine was not nearly as spiffy as this one. I mean, look at that. This is how kitsch the year got. People, it's the equivalent of buying a specialty limited edition iPhone with 1976 emblazoned on it. Or if you could get an iPhone in 76, you're a time traveler. But this is, of course, a portable radio, early days of the iPod/iPhone. This just goes to the extent to show you how ingrained it was in the culture. You could get anything in red, white, and blue that year. I have a coworker who had a pair of white bell-bottom blue jeans, blue jeans, but white jeans with red stripes and blue stars on them, and they are spectacular in the pictures I've seen. So this fervor for national history and patriotism helped Gerald Ford extensively. He even got to host as the president, a lot of the party events. He got to ride on a wagon train, essentially. It was kind of cute. But it was going to be an uphill battle for Gerald Ford because he was down so far, even this was not enough to start bringing him up. He had 2 secret weapons, though. And the first one is Betty Ford. In 1976, Betty Ford was way more popular than Gerald Ford. She was very open, very public, very charismatic, and in many ways very irreverent. This photo of her striking a pose on top of the president's cabinet room table is actually from early 1977, but it really captures the tone of Betty's relationship to the pomp of the presidency. She was her own woman, and she was standing out and making a difference and talking. Specifically, she was a social media influencer in 1976, before home computers and cellular phones. So how did she do that? By citizen band radio, aka CB radio. If you've ever heard of this, or if you haven't, this is the type of radios used by long distance truck drivers. But in the mid 1970s, everybody was using it. It was a huge fad. You could have it in your car, people had it in their boats, their homes, and people would, get a license, broadcast to their area, and chat. It was the social media of the day. Betty got on the radio and broadcast from coast to coast. Her official title as wife of the president was First Lady, but this being more of a medium of the people, and those people being primarily truckers originally, she was given the handle, aka screen name, of First Mama. And she got out there and she broadcast all over. She became very popular. And also, as the women's lib movement was progressing in America at the time, Betty was at the front of it. She was a strong supporter of the Equal Rights Amendment, a proposed amendment to the United States Constitution guaranteeing that women would in print, and therefore by law, have all the exact same rights as men. Now, this was controversial at the time because his 70s was even more conservative than we are today. And Jerry was asked at one point if he was going to, quote, rein in his wife, end quote. Not a chance. He believed in her and he believed in the cause, and he said so frequently. So she made a big difference on that forefront. Unfortunately, the amendment didn't pass. There's a time limit on those things, and it was one state short of ratification when the time limit ran out. But we have a lot of campaign buttons like this. Betty's husband for president in 76. Keep Betty's husband in the White House. I'm voting for Betty's husband. Again, she was way more popular than he was. It's not a button, but I absolutely love this poster because it really shows Betty's relationship to the public. Jerry played football, but Betty knows the score. Remember, I said he's the president that makes America eat its vegetables. He's not popular. He's making the hard choices. Betty was much more in touch with the general public of the country. She was incredibly popular, and that helped bring up Jerry's numbers. Plus, for the campaign, well, originally they had talked about him retiring in 76. She got on board, and she was willing to do campaign events like show up at a public school in Florida and awkwardly dance with a schoolboy dressed in colonial garb. We all wonder around here at the office whatever happened to that kid. But she made a big difference to Jerry's campaign. Jerry's second secret weapon is the real surprise. It's Jimmy Carter, his opponent. Jimmy was an inherently good person. We love Jimmy here, even though, spoiler alert, he wins the election. He didn't want to talk about the Nixon pardon, the Vietnam War, the clemency, or any of the other hard decisions Jerry had to make, which impacted his popularity. In fact, when asked about it, Jimmy Carter would specifically refuse to do so. Now, this cartoon is adorable, but it stresses how much people wanted Jimmy Carter to start banging on Ford's negatives, and he refused to do so. He ran a very clean, polite campaign. And that was, first of all, very classy guy, Jimmy Carter. But he didn't want to talk about the last 3 years. That was really his point. He didn't want to talk about what had come before. He didn't want to talk about Watergate. He didn't want to talk about the Vietnam War. He wanted to talk about the next 4 years. And he wanted to talk about his vision for what he could do better than Jerry could. So it was really about the future. And that's what he focused on. Now, of course, it's political campaigns. So you get some tacky buttons. Jimmy Carter had owned a peanut farm. So there were a lot of digs about peanuts with Jimmy Carter. But then, of course, vote for Carter, Ford will pardon you. There were a lot of digs about Jerry going on as well. That kind of thing happens in every campaign. So it was pretty minimal, though. They actually were very very polite to each other. There was no muckraking, and they had a series of 3 very gracious debates against each other. It was a very clean campaign, and they respected each other. So that was a real help to Jerry because he didn't have to run on the past. He had to run on the vision for the future. All right, campaign gets underway. By the middle of the year, we get to 4th of July, Independence Day, America's birthday. And Jerry was able to spend some time celebrating that, which normally the 4th of July is a day for like a family barbecue, trip to the public park or the beach, especially here in Michigan where we have tons of beaches, fireworks in the evening. Very relaxed day. People have a good picnic, a good barbecue, and spend some time with family. Not so much for Jerry Ford when it's a momentous anniversary like the Bicentennial. That photo of Ford riding atop a wagon was his first stop on 4th of July, Valley Forge, Pennsylvania, 9 a.m., which is 150 miles from his bed in D.C. So by 9 a.m., he's already traveled 150 miles to stand on a wagon and wave a hat. Then he goes off to Philadelphia for a speech at Independence Hall. That's only 25 miles away, hop, skip, and a jump. But he gives a very nice, very stunning, very moving speech about American history and where we're going as a nation. From there, after a very quick lunch, he runs 95 miles to New York City, where he's in the harbor on top of a battleship, as 200 sailing ships from 30 different nations sail the harbor for a sort of parade of ships. They called it the Tall Ship Festival. Very cool. He gets to do that in the afternoon. Then he runs the 225 miles back to Washington, D.C. for a massive fireworks display over the basically Washington Mall, the National Mall. It's a big park in downtown D.C. Massive fireworks display broadcast all over the country. So he's put about 500 miles round trip in on the 4th of July. Great. He's not done by a long shot. It's basically turned into a week of celebrations for him. July 5th, he goes to Monticello, the home of Thomas Jefferson, author of the Declaration of Independence, which was July 4th, 1776, which is why that's the date. And there, Jerry Ford attends a naturalization ceremony where a huge number of people who are taking American citizenship perform their oath ceremony. It's a great speech, very moving. If you ever have a chance, we've got it on YouTube. And that's July 5th. Okay, so he's coming along. Well, July 6th, he gets to host a very special guest who's coming to Washington, D.C. You might recognize her, Queen Elizabeth II. This visit by Her Majesty was for several days, celebrating the bicentennial and the Anglo-American relationship. It was the subject, or it's about to be the subject, of a very special exhibit we're doing here at the museum, opening May 23rd, referred to as Waltzing with the Queen, and was the exhibit's title. So he has this huge week in July where there's a huge camera on him all the time. This is a mix of doing politics and campaigning and just celebrating America's birthday. It helps lift him. Let's go back to the campaign. They were making ground on Carter's lead, but not without some challenges. Nothing ever goes easily in a campaign, right? The first one was that Ford was facing an almost unprecedented challenge from within his own party. Since he'd never been elected, they're having a primary, a pre-election election essentially, to determine if he's actually going to be the candidate for president in 1976. He had a challenger in one young Ronald Reagan, governor of California. He sought to become the Republican Party's candidate for president and spent the first half of the year campaigning against Ford, which involved some very vicious and public attacks on Ford's character and accomplishments and record. They had an actual national convention for the Republican Party where delegates from all the states got together to vote and choose their candidate. And it was a very narrow one. They called it the shootout at Kansas City because it was held in Kansas City. And Ford won by a narrow 54 to 45% margin. So the party itself was split on whether or not he should be the candidate. Traditionally, after a convention like this, the losers throw all of their support wholeheartedly behind the winner at the convention, so that it's for the good of the party. Ronald Reagan very conspicuously refused to do so. Essentially, he took his supporters and went home and said, if you're not voting for Reagan, don't vote for Ford. This would wind up costing Ford a lot in the election. It's a very heavy blow when your party's not behind you. Now, as much as I love Jerry Ford, I will be open about saying he was not the best public speaker. He acquitted himself fairly well in the 3 debates with Jimmy Carter, but there was a slip of the tongue when asked about Soviet domination in Poland. He had been to Poland when he was not president, before he was president. When asked about that, his specific quote was that there is no Soviet domination of Eastern Europe, and there never will be under a Ford administration. Of course, at that time, Poland was very much under the rule of Moscow. When pressed by the moderator, Ford responded that he didn't believe that the Poles considered themselves dominated by the Soviet Union. And he clarified the following day and the future multiple times what he meant was that the spirit of the people was not dominated. But the gaffe stood, and it hurt his campaign even further. It made him look out of touch and like he didn't really understand what was going on with the Cold War. And then there's everybody's favorite gaffe. And I have another poll here. Papa 1 in the chat if you've ever eaten a tamale. I'll give you a couple of seconds. If you've ever had a tamale, Papa 1 in the chat. I'm not seeing any ones. I'm not surprised. So, a tamale is a Mesoamerican food. It's a corn dough called masa, which often includes meat and cheese inside it. It's then wrapped in a corn husk and steamed. They're delicious. We usually think of them as Mexican food here because Mesoamerican, but you get them at Mexican-American restaurants. Now, if you've never had one, neither had Jerry Ford before 1976 campaigning in San Antonio, Texas. Someone handed him a plate which included a tamale. Not knowing about the removable corn husk, because you're supposed to remove the corn husk before you eat it, that's the wrapper while it's steamed, he took a great big bite right through the corn husk and all. If you can see that woman's concerned face and Jerry trying to chew an entire corn husk, it's not great. It must have been a slow news day because this made national news. It's added to Jerry's reputation as a bumbler. He had famously tripped coming down the stairs from Air Force One, which gave him the reputation of being clumsy. This kind of thing did not help. So the campaign's not going great. In the end, Jerry Ford loses to Jimmy Carter. The final result was 50% for Carter and 48% of the vote for Ford. Considering the original margin of over 30 points, this is pretty amazing. Ford campaigned so hard that by the end of it, he had lost his voice. He was doing appearances right up until it was time for the polls to close, when he retreated to Grand Rapids, Michigan, sat down and watched the numbers come in. And it was neck and neck right until it finally got called. Betty Ford called Jimmy Carter and said, Jerry's lost his voice, but he wanted me to know that he's conceding the election and he congratulates you. Ford wrote a very nice letter in which he congratulates the victor and offers all the help he and his team can provide with the transition. This is traditional, but it was also a little step higher than that for Ford. He wanted to make it clear, I didn't win, you did. It's my job to pass the baton and do it right. So, January 20th, 1977, President Carter arrives in the morning at the White House, President-elect Carter, to meet with President Ford, his soon-to-be predecessor. They have a very, very convivial meeting, and then they ride together to Carter's inauguration. This is held on the steps of the U.S. Capitol building. At the inauguration, President Carter continued to show true class by asking President Ford to rise for a round of applause, saying, "For myself and for our nation, I want to thank my predecessor for all he has done to heal our land. It was a very classy moment and a very good transition, which after the problems of Watergate, the Agnew resignation, the Nixon resignation, we as a country really needed that. We needed to see how the reins of power should be handled and handed off. The two of them cemented that again in the American consciousness as, right, we're back on track. It was after the Ford presidency, and even after the Carter presidency, that the two of them, who had been opponents but not enemies, wound up becoming good friends. Jerry mostly retired to play golf after his presidency. He did some consulting work, but he stayed out of Jimmy Carter's way. However, when Jimmy needed assistance or the opinion of somebody else who'd had the chair, there were not many people he could talk to. The only two predecessors he had who were alive were Gerry Ford and Richard Nixon, and neither Ford nor Carter were talking to Nixon. So it's a very small club, the presidents of the United States. If you want to know, hey, how do I talk to this person? How do I deal with the president of this country? How do I talk to these people? You have to talk to a predecessor. So Jimmy would occasionally call Jerry and say, hey, I have a question for you. Jerry was happy to help. He was happy to serve as president because he recognized, I'm not in the chair anymore. My job is to help Jimmy. There was some talk in 1980 when Reagan was running for president of Jerry coming along as vice president. That lasted something less than 36 hours. It was a very short, hey, do you want to try this? And both of them went, no. So basically, Jerry retires. Now, after Jimmy's out of office, Reagan did do a lot of international diplomacy, and he would call on former presidents to help him. So Jerry and Jimmy spent some time on the road together, and they got to be pretty good friends. After our museum opened here, we would occasionally have Jimmy and Jerry together on stage. That's actually from our auditorium at the library in Ann Arbor, Michigan. They became really good friends. They shared a bond of believing in what they had done and what they could have done, but also just, having been in the same position. It's a very small group. I think they did a really good job getting past the, hey, yes, we were opponents, but they were never enemies. They even made a deal. Whoever passed away first, the other would give that person's eulogy. When Gerald Ford passed away in 2006, President Carter's eulogy was a very sweet, tear-jerking speech. And he repeats his phrase from the inauguration, thanking his predecessor for all he did to heal our country. When President Carter passed away last year, Stephen Ford, one of Gerald Ford's sons, gave the equally heartfelt eulogy that his father had written for Jimmy Carter. I'm not going to play either of them because I wouldn't make it through that without crying. I do recommend they're up there on YouTube. Might be worth a look. 1976 for Gerry Ford was a year of challenges. He had to deal with a lot of the choices he had made as president, but he also had the opportunity to celebrate America, which was, again, a challenge at the time because we were coming through some rough stuff. On the other hand, of all the years, you would think that that one was probably one of his favorites. Hard, but also amazing. And since I'm an educator, I am happy to open the floor for Q&A.
Thank you ever so much, Richard. I really enjoyed that. It was great stuff. Really good fun, and really informative as well, and some great images. And there's already one question already in the Q&A from David. But if anyone can't access the Q&A, because Zoom's been updated, then feel free just to put your question in the chat, and we'll find it that way. So I've got some questions, but I'll hand over the floor to David first. So David asked a question. Thanks for another great talk. Hope don't bring the tone down. I think it was April 76 that the church report was released. I'd be very interested to know whether Given your extensive knowledge of and unique access to the archive over some years, you feel there is any evidence in there which adds to our understanding of Ford's reactions to and thoughts on the intelligence scandals of the era. So Ford has come down as a president who sought to block release of information, for example, are he plans to assassinate foreign leaders? Do the archives add any context or deeper sense of Ford's motives and rationale?
Ooh, that is a fantastic question. And I'll tell you, I have not personally researched the Church Report. However, after 25 years in Congress, I can tell you that Ford spent a lot of time on not the intelligence committees, but the armed service committees. And he was, I'm trying to find the best way to put this in a even-handed manner. He was a firm believer throughout the Cold War in supporting our intelligence communities. Now, that isn't to say that he loved the House Un-American Activities Committee wholeheartedly. He saw a lot of both sides of the argument. He understood that there are some things which do have to remain classified. But I don't think he would have been in favor of out-and-out assassination. I can't make that statement guaranteedly because I've never been inside his head. But without having read more on the Church Report itself, that's about the best I can tell you, I'm afraid. He would have understood the need to keep certain things classified. As for government failures, he was a very strong critic on when things were not going the way they were supposed to. One of the other things which Gerald Ford is known for is actually UFOs. He didn't believe in them, but in the 1960s, when he was a congressman, there was a series of sightings in Michigan, and people wanted a government investigation of it. So they would write to their congressman, in this case, Jerry Ford. Again, he didn't believe in UFOs, but he believed in his constituents. So when the Air Force sort of blew them off and said, swamp gas, he said, no, we need an actual investigation. I get the feeling that if he had had another 4 years in office, you would have seen more action on that.
That's very interesting, especially given that, obviously President Trump has recently said, isn't it, it's going to maybe be declassified when it comes to UFOs as well. I've got some questions as well about sort of people are gathering there. Oh, there's one. Someone's clearly no one wants to ask a question, which is fair enough. Mike asks, given President Ford's lack of electoral mandate to act as president, did this hamper his ability to negotiate with the elected members of Congress to facilitate or frustrate legislation, program, and/or policies?
Excellent question. So, yeah, he had no electoral mandate. He did, however, have 25 years in Congress himself. So right after he is sworn in, he goes to address Congress. And he says, look, you all know me. I'm pretty bipartisan. I want to work with you. I want to have a good marriage with Congress. I don't want us to fight. I want us to get along. Now, that didn't always work. After the pardon, he was asked to appear before Congress to defend his actions. And he did. He was one of only like 3 presidents at that point to have done so, willingly, without being summoned, just asked to show up, and he did. The other 2 were George Washington and Abraham Lincoln. He was in pretty good company. He respected the authority of Congress because he'd been in it for so long. However, once he started using the veto power on so many spending bills, then yes, it did come back to haunt him. And also, I will point out that as a Republican, he was facing a primarily Democratic-controlled Congress for his entire time in office. So their relationship was not perfect, but he was not working with a specific mandate. That actually kind of helped him. He didn't have his personal program that he wanted to work on. He was trying to solve problems that existed before he became president. So he would say, we need to fight inflation. Here are some ideas I have. This is the Whip Inflation Now program, which was a colossal failure and a laughingstock. But he wasn't trying to fulfill election promises that he had campaigned hard on. So it was less a matter of him fighting for something he had promised people and more of a, I need to fix this problem. What do we think will work? Six of one, half of a dozen of the other. It's really when he starts using his veto power that he starts getting into a more animous relationship and more animosity in his relationship with Congress. Great question.
Yeah, definitely. I was wondering about the gaffes, which are obviously part of the election against Carter. So I didn't actually know about the food one. Obviously about the Soviet. There's no Soviet domination in Eastern Europe one.
Yeah.
But were the gaffes more sort of impactful because of shows like SNL? So because
Yes.
of like so basically the narrative had already been established about President Ford, and then you have the gaffes that kind of therefore confirms the narrative and the culture, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So this first year of Saturday Night Live, Jerry Ford becomes quite the laughingstock nationwide. Chevy Chase creates a Jerry Ford character and then spends entire skits falling over himself. I'm President Ford, trip. I'm President Ford, trip. And then they made fun of the debates. There was one famous joke where there was the moderator of the debate on Saturday Night Live asks a question, and Chase, as President Ford, says, I was promised there would be no math. So, yeah, he takes a huge beating in the press. I mean, that's part of why we have a free press. They have the right to pick on the president. And in fact, it's important. It's the jester role. You got to take the wind out of the president. Jerry was okay with that. He actually, right after we opened this museum, we had a conference on humor and the presidency, and he invites Chevy Chase to the conference. Yeah, we have a great picture of them sitting together in our auditorium telling jokes. We also have a picture of Jerry Ford tripping Chevy Chase down a set of stairs, but it's staged. They're both really yucking it up. It's a staged photograph making fun of their relationship. Ford took a beating in the media for all sorts of things. He made controversial choices. He made decisions that he thought were for the good of the country and people didn't like. He was okay with every hit he took. Not all of them were necessarily fair, but that's part of being the president. You're going to take hits from the media. But you're right, especially Saturday Night Live is the one where they made their bones in their first year picking on the president. What you going to do?
I suppose also coming from New York as well on live on Saturday night. Of course, we've got New York City being, being told to. Well, I don't even say drop dead, but obviously when he said we were going to bail New York out, when they're in their financial difficulties, perhaps New Yorkers were kind of like egging on SNL. So in some ways, then did actually the Ford presidency, in terms of the culture, in terms of comedy and humor and satire, I suppose. That kind of it's been a model which has been followed ever since. Because even now, you'll have presidents that are mocked and made fun of. The debates are always made fun of, whether it's the primary debates or the presidential election debates as well. So it's almost it's a model was put in place during '76 in terms of how people related to the presidency, maybe, and how entertainment relates to the presidency as well.
In some ways, yeah, it definitely ramped up in '76. It existed before that, but you have to think of Gerald Ford as the person who didn't come into the office with all the prestige of a presidency. Not having been elected, he was very much seen as just being a guy who got the job. During the course of campaigns, presidents really ramped themselves up as how presidential they are, et cetera, et cetera. When the Nixon family left the White House, suddenly, January 20th, every 4 years or 8 years, depending if someone gets reelected, they pack up the entire presidency and haul it all out on semi trucks. At the same time, they move the new person in. It's apparently a very difficult and well orchestrated ballet of moving furniture. That didn't happen for Nixon Ford. In fact, it was almost 2 weeks before the Nixons were out of the White House and the Fords could move in. For the first 2 weeks of his presidency, Gerald Ford commuted to work from his home in Virginia. He would come out in the morning with his briefcase and his newspaper, wearing his baseball cap, and get in the car, and the Secret Service would drive him to D.C. So there are a lot of pictures of a very suburban street with the President of the United States going to work. It's a very different transition. It really, in some ways, humanized and de-escalated the presidency. So it also opened him up for a lot of critique.
It's great image of the president commuting to work, but also the idea. So was President Nixon in the White House then after he, or was it
No,
just the Nixon family?
he he and Pat flew out, but they left all their possessions, all of the papers, all that stuff. And normally it takes, weeks to pack up all that stuff. So it took weeks to pack up all that stuff.
Mm. So yeah, just the idea of Nixon as a kind of a squatter in the White House. Obviously, and actually, when in the helicopter, he kind of like flew off, really just kind of circled back round and went back to his
No, no,
children in
they
the
did go
residence
off
there.
to California, thankfully.
But also just wondering as well about, of course, what in some ways there's a in '76 the person you mentioned is Ronald Reagan. And did Ford and Carter kind of bond over Reagan and their
A little bit.
dislike and distrust of Ronald Reagan?
Yeah, it comes down to Reagan taking his followers and going home in 76 was a very personal blow to Ford. And Ford and Reagan could work together, but it is well known that Nancy Reagan and Betty Ford never got along. And so, yeah, that was part of it. Carter and Carter and Ford have this sort of bubble relationship with Nixon on one side and Reagan on the other. It's just like you and me against the world, buddy.
Because I suppose there is a school of thought there's that for Reagan, he might have seen himself though as the next in line. If Watergate had happened, Nixon gets the end of his 2 terms. Reagan, as a former governor of California, he would have
Yeah.
fancied his chances to.
Oh yeah.
And so Gerald Ford was kind of in the way, wasn't he, effectively?
Yeah. Reagan really felt that 76 was his time, but it was really 80 that he grew and shone. But then we get 8 years of Reagan. So by the end of that, you basically have Reagan, Ford, Carter, Nixon. And there are pictures of 5 or 6 presidents together. But we had some periods in the 20th century where there were 1, maybe 2 presidents alive at a time. It was very, very weird.
I mean, how did all the other presidents get along? So obviously you have Ford and Carter were close, but as of course the President's Club got bigger in the '80s and the '90s, did they all get along? Was it just did they all like Reagan or
No.
Bush, or was it just like
They all could socialize politely. That does not mean they were friends. Jerry and Jimmy were friends, and they could be in a room with Nixon and Reagan, but I wouldn't say they all got along.
there's that great book, isn't there, the President's Club, where they were kind of talk to each other and like Nixon's kind of advising Reagan, but also advises Clinton as well.
Yeah.
Foreign policy stuff as well. Just wondering about what was Gerald Ford's plan? So obviously he came into the Oval Office thinking, oh, just do a couple of years and I'll go out. Then he decided I quite like the plane and I quite like the office and I wouldn't mind carrying on. But did he think that he could win '76 and then win in '80? Because he could have ran in '80, couldn't he?
No, he
Could not
couldn't.
run in '90. Was he
Could
too
not.
far in? Not,
The 22nd Amendment prohibits anyone from being elected to the presidency more than twice, or if they have been serving a portion of somebody else's term for more than 2 years and a day, being elected once. Since Ford had more than that, 895 days, he could only himself be elected to the presidency once. And of course, this goes back to FDR, who won the presidency 4 times. And after that, both parties said, we never want to see that again. So that amendment sailed through Congress.
so Nixon resigned just too late then for Gerald Ford, thinking about 10 years, effectively.
I mean, too early. If Nixon had held on to, 2 years minus a day, Ford could have been elected twice.
Yeah. So it was first Ford. At what point though did Gerald Ford decide he wanted to run?
We know that he had the discussion with Betty sort of late 75, but I think it was somewhere in maybe mid 75 that he said, I am doing good and I think I can do more good. A lot of the decisions he made were very controversial, but actually very impactful. Helsinki goes down in history as one of those things that helped bring down the Soviet Union. And it was a terrible thing for, a president to have done that. It was conceding a point to the Soviet Union. It was political suicide. But Jerry's like, you know what? It needs to be done. And nobody who had been running for that office or really had their heart set on winning it again was going to make that call.
Right.
He decided to run. It was very clear, even from the beginning, that it was an uphill battle. He was probably going to lose. Honestly, if he had not run and it had been Reagan, Carter in 76, we'd be living in a completely different world. But who knows?
Yeah, I think Carter would have. A Democrat was going to win in '76 because of Watergate. I think.
Yeah.
I think it was a good. Thinking about it's about vision. So Ford, when he comes in, he's thinking about he's a problem solver because he's got no mandate. But does he develop a vision as he gets close to thinking about election? And what then, if he does actually have that vision, does he actually articulate? So really, what is the Ford? What's Fordism? Effectively, you have Reagan, but what what does he develop a vision ever, or does he project a vision?
Yeah. The problem is Fordism was there are still problems I want to fix. It was, another 4 years of me trying to fix what's wrong with the country, and I don't think you can sell that easily. A lot of his speeches are about, hey, now we have to work, fix the economy. And frankly, our problems with the economy didn't even get fixed under Carter. They finally ended under Reagan. That was when we really got that back under control. So it's hard to say what Fordism was. He didn't ever really establish a mandate for himself, even while campaigning in 76. And when that's your argument is, I can fix it better than the other guy, there were just too many people who are going to say, yeah, but we want the other guy's party in control for a while because your party's been making a mess of things. I mean, we had 5 years of Nixon. But, not that Nixon didn't do anything right. But by the end of it, nobody loved him. He had tainted his entire memory.
Because obviously when he wins re-election, he wins this massive landslide. He's massively decisive. So it's almost like 60% of the popular vote. I know that's not the main thing, obviously, electoral college, but he wins obviously the electoral college decisively in the mandate as well. So in some ways, did Watergate effectively ruin the Republican brand or destroy that coalition?
Yeah, it really did for a while. It took a palate cleanser like Gerald Ford to say, okay, we fixed the things we broke to as much as we can. But then, 76, it's going to be a Democrat because the brand is just broken for the Republicans. And Jimmy Carter was a charismatic, genuinely good person. What you going to do? I'm impressed Jerry managed to get it as close as he did. But yeah,
This is more,
I represent the president whose job was to patch things. And if that's how Jerry's remembered, I think he'd be okay with that. He walked into a broken situation and he made it better. But nobody loves the parent who makes kids eat their vegetables.
No, someone's like, he's almost thinking too long term. How in terms of the American, like the 200th anniversary, the Bicentennial, what was the mood like? Because obviously you've had Watergate, you've had Vietnam. So was this sort of like an optimistic time? Was it like a reflective time, a regretting time? I mean, what kind of party was it?
It was among other things, a lot of things were done in the spirit of let's fix past things and move forward. In 1976, Gerald Ford signs into law Black History Month in the United States. He also signs a presidential proclamation acknowledging the error, the wrongness of the executive order that rounded up Japanese Americans in 1942. And he rescinded that executive order. And you have to keep in mind, it's been 34 years before a president says, That was wrong. We shouldn't have done that. There was a time of, okay, we have made mistakes. We need to fix them and move forward. And there was a lot of rah-rah. It was very impressive. We had red, white, and blue everything. But at the same time, it did take into account things aren't perfect, but let's move forward together.
And how does it compare now?
Oof. Sorry, my political acumen really ends January 20th, 1977.
Yeah. I mean, so the celebrations comes the is the 250th anniversary as big a deal as 200th anniversary?
No, but I mean, it's harder to spell for one thing. Semi-quincentennial. There are a lot of jokes in newspapers where people actually are like, yes, this year is the semi-quincentennial. Will that even fit on a Scrabble board if you wanted to try and get that word? Yeah. So it's not the same spirit. It's what you're going to do. Bicentennial was just a huge moment.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's obviously 1976, 1776 is much more obvious.
Yeah.
Well.
Yeah, I occasionally bump into people and I explain to them that we're doing all these programs. They're like, oh, yeah, I guess it is.
Yeah.
It's much harder to market your 45th birthday, 40th birthday, big deal. 50th birthday, big deal. 45th.
Yeah, definitely something in the PR there. So what would you say was kind of Ford's impact on the Republican Party?
I think in some ways he made it okay to be a Republican again after Nixon.
Yeah.
But it was the reset they needed to be able to field a candidate in 80. I think that if Reagan had won in 76, he'd probably have lost to Carter. I think Jerry was able to turn it around. I don't think that Reagan coming in could have done that. And then, if Reagan loses Carter in 76, does he run in 80, et cetera, et cetera? I think that it was a good thing we had Jimmy for 4 years.
Yeah.
I think it was a good thing for the Republican Party that we had Jimmy for 4 years because it allowed them to reset and distance themselves from Nixon.
Also, you talked about how there's talk of Ford and Reagan teaming up in 1980. But how serious is Gerald Ford about running again in 1980? Did he actually seriously think
he's not?
No.
No, he'd been out of office for 4 years. He knew his moment had flown. People were posing the like, do you want to run? He's like, no. Do you want to be his vice president? No. Do you want to be? And somebody actually in some room said, what if we had co-presidents? And everyone looked at that person and said, what are you, stupid? That idea never got out of that room, but somebody wrote it down as something stupid that somebody said.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It also kind of comes up, I think, almost like the Reagan people. I think if you look at their oral histories, they see it as almost like an attempt to kind of like mitigate Reagan or have like Gerald Ford as like the real president, and like Reagan would go to the funeral or something like that, and Ford would always be in charge apparatus of governments and the machinery. I would be really the president.
So one thing you can say about Jerry Ford is after all of his time in Congress, he really understood how the government worked. He had a very firm handle on the 3 branches of government, the checks, the balances, and just the mechanics of it. Whereas Reagan coming in as being governor of California did not have that knowledge of how, the fundamental structures of the government work. Ford was very good at that part of the job. The actual making politically savvy choices was never his priority.
It's quite interesting. You think about that generation in Congress, though, where Ford's in Congress with Kennedy's in Congress, Nixon's been in Congress. I don't perhaps go back to what the 19th century or the first half of the 19th century, but a comparable sort of class of people, sort of in the entering politics around the same time, and then taking their turn. A bygone age. I've got one more question from Mike, who turns out is actually in Australia. He teaches. Mike says, I'm new to US National Archives Zoom talks. I'm in Australia and I teach modern history in high school. What sort of pattern of talks from this body can look forward to, please? So, obviously, Mike, we'll always try and put on things from a York St John perspective with colleagues such as Richard in the Ford Library, but I think maybe it's a chance for Rich to talk about what you guys get up to at the Ford Library, or how else can we engage with you guys
Oh,
and find your events and so on, what kind of things are coming up, maybe which people around the world can participate in.
sure. Well, I will tell you from Australia, live is going to be tricky for you. I can't even imagine what time it is right there right now. What are you, 14 hours ahead? Whew, thank you for attending. Um, 14 hours ahead of me. Um, so generally what we do is we have here at the museum 2 to 3 lectures in the evening, open to the public per month. Yeah, I thought so, Mike. Yeah. Wow. Thanks for being here. But we have these lectures and then we live stream them. So we have book talks, we have a lot of programs at the Ford Museum. You can check us out on our social media. We will, put these up. We also record the majority of them to put them up on our YouTube because modern technology is amazing. These 2 talks are actually James's idea. He reached out and said, "Hey, for the Bicentennial, what if we did a thing?" And we were excited to do it. So thank you very much, James. Um, but mostly most of my programming is for school age groups and does not get live cast in any way, shape, or form. But our evening program, a lot of it gets either simulcast or filmed and put on our YouTube. But you can check out all of the presidential libraries to see what we do. There are 14 of us and counting at this point. It's a lot of fun. Thanks for asking, Mike, and thanks for beaming in.
Yeah, mate, and I subscribe to a few of the libraries, and they always get regular events and things like which you live stream on YouTube and so on. So I think they're definitely great services and great what you're all doing to make such things accessible to everyone.
That's
So
our mission, is we have all of these things, and my job is to make them available to people and help people understand American history through our stuff.
yeah, well, I think so. You've done that today, Richard. And thank you ever so much again. I think our contract time is up, and we've
Sure.
monopolised enough of your time already. But thank you ever so
No
much for
problem.
doing this. Really appreciate it. I hope we can do something similar again. And big thanks to everyone who's attended, from the students who got on the screen rather than the sun outside, and of course Mike for coming from Australia.